There are some characters that never really go away. When you observe that character thinking about the same issues you do on a daily basis, you can't help but think, this character has thought about the issues I've been thinking about for a long time. You and the character become attached to one other at that point. For me, Rust from True Detective is like that. I think about a lot of things in life, such the presence of God, the human soul, life after death, and the problem of evil, which includes things like serial killers, natural disasters, and really painful children. Naturally, these are questions that a lot of people are thinking about. True Detective is the most engaging story I've ever seen tackle these topics. Excellent performances and cinematography elevated True Detective to a television program I would never forget. Alright, let's get started. Our two primary characters are Rust and Marty, who are both detectives and co-workers. Rust is a very melancholy man who lost his daughter in a vehicle accident and split from his wife. Despite his inability to get along with people and his own admittance of awkwardness at gatherings, he is a gifted detective. He's an expert at deftly putting puzzle pieces together. In contrast, Marty is livelier and friendlier than Rust. His issues are connected to his family. Throughout the entire series, Marty pays the price for cheating on his wife and neglecting his kids. One day, these two extremely different detectives come across a murder committed by a demon. We notice similar marks on the bodies of other ladies, and the body of a small kid is positioned at the base of a peculiar tree. Undoubtedly, a serial killer is at large. The plot of our novel centers on Rust and Marty's hunt for this serial killer. We confront the philosophical concerns the story raises, even as we sympathize with their personal struggles. Without a doubt, Rust is the one who gives the narrative its intellectual depth. According to Rust, human life is basically a horrible experience, and that we are just emotional puppets, controlled by our cravings. Unlike other living things, human awareness is capable of self-reflection. However, human pain is also a result of this advanced consciousness. This awareness is a scourge upon humanity. According to Rust, humans are a sad error in the evolutionary process, rather than a creation of God. People love to believe they are unique, that the Creator is watching over them, that their misfortunes are testing them, and most importantly, that the Creator loves them, according to Rust. People love to think of themselves as, I am special, I am important, and they never want to admit that they are really biological puppets. Rust claims that religious leaders take advantage of this very vulnerability. They take use of our romantic tendencies, convincing us that there is hope, and even calling this optimism a virtue. According to Rust, religious belief detaches a person from reality and impairs critical thinking. Furthermore, Rust feels that his abilities as a gifted homicide detective, who solves murders through critical thinking, would suffer if he became more religious. But this is where Marty differs from Rust. Even though he's not particularly religious, he at least isn't afraid to identify as a Christian, and thinks religion is vital. Rust asks Marty, who is correct to do so after hearing his strange thoughts, then what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning? In response, Rust says that he has a subconscious power that has programmed him to survive, and that, like all humans, he has a drive to live. Knowing that he too is a puppet designed to live, he is unable to take his own life. Rust also uses this gloomy philosophy to support his anti-nationalism viewpoint. According to Rust, raising a child in such a society would only be torturous for them. Rust believes that despite the fact that reproduction is ingrained in human nature, people should reject this aspect of their nature and give up on having children. We see a cross hanging on his wall after he has spent so much time condemning Christianity. He justifies this by stating that he identifies with Christian ideas of suffering and redemption. In Christianity, suffering is significant. A Christian grows closer to Jesus and purifies their soul through hardship. If this person has lived a life consistent with their religion, they will be saved from this terrible life and be able to experience the delights of heaven once they pass away. Rust feels a little bit like this notion of redemption. Although he rejects the idea of a hereafter, he nevertheless views death as a means of self-redemption, albeit one that differs from Christian salvation. At least his passing will put an end to these sufferings. What a bleak outlook does he really have? Now, let us ask, why does Rust behave this way? Has he always been so gloomy, or was there a particular incident that made him this way? His occupation obviously has an effect. His profession fosters his gloominess. He exhibits occupational deformity. He sees scores of bodies in his line of work as a homicide detective, and his continual pursuit of ruthless murderers forces him to confront the idea of death, which he already finds difficult to accept. But we would be missing the bigger picture if we assumed that Rust's pessimism was only a result of his line of work. Recall that Rust lost his daughter in an automobile accident. After that, he had to divorce his wife due to his extreme despair. Rust is extremely bitter about life since he is going through what is arguably the worst anguish in the world, the pain of losing a child. I suppose my daughter is forgiven when I think of her. I'm even appreciative. According to the doctor, my daughter entered a coma right away and vanished into the deepest shadows without feeling anything at all. Isn't that a lovely course of action? To depart in happiness and pain-free. In addition, my daughter delivered me from the sin of fatherhood. Rust establishes a certain causality in this part, namely that I shouldn't be sad over my daughter's death because the world is a horrible place. Yet in Rust's opinion, is this not contradictory? Why, as someone who opposes nationalism and has such a gloomy outlook on life, did he choose to become a parent with his wife in the first place? By doing this, didn't he contradict himself? Or did Rust really not think that poorly back then? The untimely passing of his daughter served as Rust's breaking point and the inspiration for his gloomy life philosophy. Because he felt the world was a terrible place from the beginning, Rust finds it so difficult to deal with this anguish that he reverses causality and tells himself that his daughter's death was a wonderful thing. In actuality, he couldn't deal with his daughter's passing and started to think the world was a horrible place. He altered his perspective, believing that his daughter's death was preferable in this terrible world since he was unable to cope with her passing, and became trapped by this belief. Regardless of perspective, the issue of evil, particularly the murder, suffering, and mistreatment of children, remains at the center of this tale. Our two detectives have a special place in their hearts for kids. Marty later gave up his career as a detective for the same reason. When Marty learned that a lowlife had burned his own infant in a microwave, he quit his job, saying, "That's it, I don't want to see anything like this again." When someone found out that their infant had been given drugs, even Rust, who was known for his cold-bloodedness, became enraged and killed the individual. Children are the focus of both the demonic cult that Rust and Marty are pursuing and the serial killer they are pursuing. As you can see, children are at the center of both the good and the bad in this story. In True Detective, evil is viewed not only as a person or an institution, but also as a cosmic evil. Rust's ideology holds that everything, the earth, the universe, and creation is fundamentally evil. This wickedness is dispersing throughout individuals and places like an energy. Every now and then, Rust smells or tastes this cosmic creature known as evil. Rust and Marty are searching for a single serial killer, but the evil they come across cannot be attributed to a single individual. This murderer is the offspring of a long-running, child-abusing satanic sect. Their father mistreated both the murderer and his sister. His family and relatives have a near tradition of abusing children. The killer is the final link in a line of evil that his ancestors and family have passed down to him. Rust and Marty occasionally experience shame in this vicious cycle. After searching for the serial killer for 17 years, these two finally apprehend him. They initially believed they had apprehended the murderer during these 17 years, but later discovered that similar killings had persisted. They learn much later that the individual they apprehended was not the actual murderer. There were times when Marty and Rust both came dangerously close to apprehending the murderer. For instance, Rust was aware that the murderer had scars on his face. He also happened to spot the murderer one day while he was mowing the lawn and spoke with him. But the sun was shining on the man's face, and Rust missed the scars on his skin. The murderer they were searching for was standing right in front of Rust if he had looked at the man's face a bit more intently at that precise moment. Marty also lost his cool, killing a man they believed to be the murderer. Instead of shooting the man, he may have discovered who the true murderer was and even where he was hiding if he had questioned the man. These killings might have been avoided if Rust and Marty had apprehended the murderer sooner. This explains why we are so devoted to these two characters, Rust in particular. He accepts responsibility as his recklessness causes him pain. He bears this weight like a cross on his back and admits that he is connected to this web of evil, if only indirectly. Finally, after 17 years of searching, Rust and Marty find the murderer. The murderer is now dead, despite the fact that both of them wind up in the hospital following a gunfight. Compared to Marty, Rust sustains far more serious injuries and is left in a coma for some time. He tells Marty about his magical experience when he wakes up and they meet in the hospital garden. He sensed the warmth and presence of his father and deceased daughter while he lay in a coma. This man is captivated by an experience that defies rational explanation, despite his pragmatic approach to life. He then discusses the continuous conflict between light and darkness with Marty. Since the dawn of time, good and evil have been at conflict, and this war will ultimately have no winner. Rust once said, "There was only darkness." Though he is nonetheless pragmatic, he displays a romantic optimism surprising from a gloomy character. If you ask me, the light's winning. Ultimately, both characters know that they have destroyed the central authority within the child-abusing organization. Somewhere, this group is still cultivating evil. There have been evildoers who have gotten away with their crimes and never been apprehended. In spite of everything, Rust and Marty have succeeded in their mission by taking out the murderer they were pursuing. While this victory may seem insignificant in the grand scheme of cosmic evil, it is sufficient to bring these two characters, who were on the verge of death, back to life. Who is the antagonist, the hero, and who is correct and incorrect in this tale? There is no denying the bad side, and we consider Rust to be a hero when we realize he is the best at battling it. However, Rust is not precisely a role model, because all of the characters in this series, Rust included, constantly contradict themselves. Let's take a look at Marty before moving on to Rust. From the beginning, Marty had been critical of Rust's isolation. However, take a look at Marty, a man who betrays his spouse. For the benefit of their kids, his wife pardons him when he cheats for the first time. But when he does it again, she ultimately takes the kids and departs. Following his divorce, Marty's life has been nothing but misery. He is isolated and melancholy. Being alone in his older years is the price he pays for all the passion of one-night stands and mistresses. Ultimately, he finds himself in the same predicament for which he had chastised Rust, that is, alone, without a family. Naturally, when it comes to loneliness, we find Rust to be more compassionate than Marty. Ultimately, Marty's loneliness stems from his ongoing infidelity to his spouse. In contrast, Rust was unable to keep his marriage intact due to his deep depression following the death of his daughter. He is adamant that there is no God and that existence is essentially hopeless and pointless. It is also necessary to mention how irritating his arrogant demeanor is. Rust is chilly, aloof, and unduly serious, making him the last person you would want to have a good time with in this world. Rust feels the most human of all the characters in the series, in spite of all his attitudes. When he was in a coma, he spoke of feeling his father and daughter there. Although Rust had the option to dismiss the encounter as a psychological ploy, he chose to accept its enchantment. He felt that he could still sense the presence of his loved ones, and that death was not the end. Ultimately, he gave in to the attraction of emotions he was still having trouble explaining. In that transcending experience, he found the serenity that logic could not provide. In the end, this character, who thought the world was a horrible place, had to concede that life was worthwhile. Because he realized that, in spite of that terrible ending, the wonderful moments he shared with his daughter, or the connection he forged with Marty, a person he had disliked from the beginning, made up for his pessimism. Don't assume that the show is attempting to convey a religious message with its last-minute romanticism. True Detective never affirms that something is true or offers us the whole picture or the whole truth. Rather than asserting that religion is good or bad or that life has purpose or no purpose, it demonstrates how much more nuanced the issue is than we may realize. True Detective suggests that we shouldn't consider good and evil to be limited to interactions between good and terrible people. Evil has a place in the cosmos and in human lives. A person battles their own inner evil in addition to the evil that surrounds them. Rust put it this way: "This is a world where nothing is solved. This is a harsh and destructive circle. I once heard that time is just a flat circle. We will repeat all we have ever done and will continue to do repeatedly." It is evident how much Rust's statements align with Nietzsche's theory of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche challenges us to consider the possibility that we will live this life indefinitely more than once. It looks terrifying at first, doesn't it? Reliving all our suffering and regrets. Nietzsche, however, does not end there. He also anticipates our affection for this recurrent destiny. The only way out of the curse of nihilism is for a person to accept this tedious life cycle, acknowledge that some things will never work out, and continue to consent to it. Nietzsche said that we should think of time as cyclical rather than linear and forward-moving, just like a flat circle, as Rust put it. The tranquility in Rust's last scene should be analyzed in light of Nietzsche's idea of endless repetition in addition to the comfort of sensing his father and daughter's presence. Ultimately, Rust felt the peace that comes from acknowledging this never-ending conflict between good and evil. Furthermore, this viewpoint is similar to Camus's illustration of Sisyphus, in that it views a loop that never ends. The gods made Sisyphus push a massive boulder up a mountain as a kind of punishment, but he was never able to set the rock atop. Camus said we had to perceive Sisyphus as cheerful in spite of everything. However, how could we possibly picture Sisyphus being content when he was forced to repeat the same behaviors over and over again, knowing that there would never be a resolution? According to Camus, Sisyphus's attempt to move that rock was heroic in and of itself, and his heart was satisfied with the toil and sweat of his labor. In spite of everything, Camus found enjoyment in that attempt and a cause to remain in this world. For this reason, Rust reminds me of Sisyphus. He will never be able to place that rock no matter how hard he tries, and he will never prevail in his battle against evil. But Rust's heart will be sufficiently filled with this struggle, this never-ending battle against evil. Rust may not be as miserable as we initially believed if we examine him as though he were Sisyphus.